In this lesson, we are going to carry on talking about the reign of Charles I, and we're going to talk a little bit about Puritan opposition to Charles I. And this really gives us a couple of different lenses through which we can analyse religious opposition specifically to Charles and the disputes that essentially arose as a result of this, and relations with Parliament, of course, form part of this conversation as well. And I want to begin by looking at one of the major disputes associated with this conversation about Puritan opposition. This is, of course, the St. Gregory's case, which took place in 1633 and was a religious dispute during Charles's personal rule period, and it was essentially emblematic of broader tensions between Puritans and the monarchy's ecclesiastical policies. So essentially, as a background, as a basic introduction, in 1633, Charles I appointed William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury. And we noted this in the previous video when we spent a bit of time talking about Laudism. Laud sought to enforce uniformity in worship and emphasised something known as the beauty of holiness. Essentially advocating for ceremonial practices that were seen as the sort of remnants of, or seen as too closely associated with, the concept of Catholicism. That's one of the problems with Laudian principles, were far too closely associated with ideas of Catholicism. Key among these reforms was the repositioning of the communion table to the east end of the church, treating it as an altar, surrounding it with rails. This was a shift from a central communal table to an eastward-facing railed altar, which was seen by Puritans as a move towards Catholic ritualism. So these things sound to a non-religious person as particularly trivial, but to somebody who, of course, had to potentially grow up and live through some kind of Catholic opposition, then this is, of course, very, very problematic. At St. Gregory's Church, which was adjacent to St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the Dean and Chapter implemented Laud's directives by relocating the communion table to the east end and installing rails to basically ensure the Laudian principles. 5 parishioners objected to this reform, arguing that this arrangement contravened the Book of Common Prayer as well as the 82nd Canon, which allowed for the table to be positioned where it was most convenient. They appealed to the Court of Archers, the ecclesiastical court of appeal, and ultimately Charles I would start to intervene in this particular case, which is one of the problematic aspects of St. Gregory's case. Charles I perceived the dispute as a challenge to ecclesiastical authority and directly intervened. On the 3rd of November 1633, he convened the Privy Council to deliberate on the case. The council ruled in favour of the Dean and Chapter, asserting that decisions regarding church arrangements fell under the jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical authorities and not under the wills or the whims of individual parishioners. The ruling emphasised then the importance of uniformity and adherence to these traditional practices, but more importantly, this case illustrated some of the opposition that was had against these kinds of Laudian reforms and these Puritan opposition towards Charles. More broadly then, what were some of the other Puritan discontent associated with Charles, and specifically Charles's personal rule? Well, obviously central to this was the appointment of William Laud as Archbishop in 1633. Laud's reforms emphasised, of course, ceremonial worship, the beautification of churches, the strict adherence to the Book of Common Prayer. These changes all were reminiscent of Catholic practices, which of course alarmed Puritans, who of course favoured simpler scripture-based services. In 1637, we start to see 3 Puritan critics, William Prine, John Bastwick, and Henry Burton, all being punished for publishing pamphlets that opposed the Laudian reforms. They were sentenced to mutilation and imprisonment and became martyrs in the Puritan cause, exemplifying the regime's intolerance for dissent. Problematic, as you can probably imagine. Again, in 1637, Charles's attempts to impose the English Book of Common Prayer on Scotland sparked the Bishops' Wars, as the Scots resisted resisted what they viewed to be an attack on the Presbyterian traditions. This conflict again underscores the broader resistance between Charles's religious policies and the Puritans who sought to see them be quashed. Furthermore, then, Charles's decision to govern without Parliament during this time of personal rule would lead to financial challenges. In order to raise revenue, for example, he would revive a number of obsolete taxes. Some taxes that no longer existed were seen as undemocratic, were seen as an overthrow of the royal prerogative or a sort of historical legacy of the royal prerogative. Most controversially among these was the issuance of ship money, traditionally levied in coastal areas during wartime. They weren't at war during this period, or at least not a war. There was not the excuse of war, should I say. There was the Bishops' Wars, of course. Charles extended this tax during peacetime, as I've just mentioned, and applied it not only to the coastal regions, but to the entire nation, provoking widespread opposition. So what was an old and obsolete tax that applied to coastal areas during wartime was revived and is now applied to all areas during peacetime. Not particularly very democratic. In 1637, John Hampden, who was a prominent Puritan, refused to pay the ship money, leading to a case that, despite resulting in a narrow verdict in favour of the Crown, galvanised opposition and highlighted concerns of arbitrary taxation. Additionally, we can see that Charles begins to rely on the Star Chamber, the prerogative court. This was to enforce his policies without due process, which again was perceived to be a threat to traditional English liberties and also further alienated Puritan and parliamentary figures.